Mr. Park. I'm going to ask you some questions on his behalf. Now, you said on direct examination that you warned Jesse a lot about the dangers of guns. Is that right?
Yes.
You mentioned specifically a conversation you had with your daughter on August 17th. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, in that conversation, Jesse told you that she wanted to hold the gun in Mr. Park's home. Is that right?
Yes.
And you said that you told her, Jesse, guns are dangerous. Is that right?
Absolutely.
You told her that guns weren't toys? Well, Ms. Duran, you'd recognize a copy of the statement that your daughter wrote if I showed it to you in court today. Is that right?
Yes.
Let the record reflect I'm approaching the witness with what's already been admitted as plaintiff's one. Now, you just told us that you told your daughter a lot about guns and gun violence, but I'd like you to read along silently the last line of that page as I read it aloud. It says, "No one ever told me how dangerous real guns could be. Hayden Duran told me that real guns are just like the ones in video games." Did I read that correctly?
That's right. And
Let the record reflect I'm approaching you. You also wrote an email to your friend, Casey French, in the summer of 2010. Is that right?
Yes.
And you'd recognize a copy of that email if I showed it to you in court today?
Yes.
Let the record reflect I'm approaching the witness with what's already been admitted as plaintiff's court. Ms. Duran, I've just handed you a copy of that email. Is that right?
Yes.
And you'd agree with me that in this email you expressed concern about Jesse's fascination with guns. Is that right?
Just explaining some games that Jesse was playing. Yeah.
Well, to be clear, if you start on the first big paragraph of the first line, it says, "I'm a little worried about Jesse." Is that right?
Objection, Your Honor. Human of evidence. The jury would like to read this email. They have the ability to do so themselves.
Overruled.
So it says, "I'm a little worried about Jesse." Is that right?
Yes, yeah.
It continues, "Jesse's been interested in guns for a while." Is that right?
Yes, that's true, as I've already mentioned.
It says, "But Jesse only wants to play games that seem to involve shooting hundreds of people." Is that right?
No, that's not correct. If you read it, play the game that seems to involve, it was one particular game.
But Jesse liked to play that game that involved shooting people. Is that right?
Yes, and I took it away from Jesse.
And you'd agree with me that you say, towards the bottom of that paragraph, "Other parents have been telling me that Jesse likes to point sticks at kids and say things like, 'Bang, you're dead.' Is that right?"
Yeah, just like kids.
And then you say, "Thank goodness we don't have any guns in our house."
Yes, I don't have a gun.
Absolutely. Your child spent a lot of time in your home in the summer of 2010. Is that right, Ms. Duran?
Yes.
But your child also spent a lot of time in the home of Mr. Park.
Yes.
And to be clear, Ms. Duran, you knew that the Parks had a gun in their home.
Yes, Andy did tell me. I totally forgot all about it until later in the summer.
But you'd agree with me Mr. Park did tell you that he had a gun in his home?
Yes.
You'd agree with me that you didn't send this email to Mr. Park, is that right?
No.
Even though you knew that Mr. Park had a gun in his home and that your child spent a lot of time there, you didn't think it was important to tell Mr. Park this information?
No, this information is Jesse playing video games. He already knew that. Jesse did play video games.
Well, the email also talks a lot about your concern about Jesse's fascination with guns, is that right?
I was a little worried, yes, but nothing to the concern that I feel I have to tell Mr. Park.
All right, Ms. Duran, permission to approach and retrieve. Now, Ms. Duran, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about August 17th. Do you remember that day?
Yeah.
And you'd agree with me that when you went to pick Jesse up from the Parks house, Andrew Park's babysitter, Danny Brooks, wanted to have a conversation with you. Is that right?
Yes, I talked to Danny.
Danny told you that your daughter, Jessie, knew there was a gun in Mr. Park's home. Danny told you that your daughter wanted to play with the gun in Mr. Park's home. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you told Danny Brooks that was none of her business.
Right. I'm the parent.
You told Miss Brooks that you would have a conversation with Mr. Park about that information. Is that right?
Yes, or talk to him and Jesse, and I did.
Well, you'd agree with me that you didn't call Mr. Park that night and have a conversation with him about Jesse wanting to play with the gun in his home?
No, I was going over the next day, so I was going to talk to him.
That's right, you were going over the very next day, so you walked your daughter to the Parks house the very next morning, August 18th.
Yes, she was planning to go over.
Absolutely, and when you got there, Mr. Park, he told you, there's not going to be a babysitter here today. The kids are going to be unsupervised, is that right?
That's right.
Well then surely at that point, once you learned the children would be unsupervised, you told Mr. Park your child wanted to play with the gun in his home.
No, I couldn't. It was a rush and the server had just crashed, so I dropped Jessie over and I to work.
So to be clear, even though you knew that your child wanted to play with the gun in the Parks home, even though your child told you that she wanted to hold the gun in the home, even though you knew that your child had a fascination with guns, you didn't tell Mr. Park anything about that.
No, I couldn't.
Mr. Rain, you simply dropped Jessie off and left for work.
Yes, before I talked to her about all the conversation that we had, and then I went to work.
Thank you, Mr. Rain. I have no further questions.